Sometimes the truth lies buried beneath our feet, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. For 10 years, a family's disappearance haunted the town of Bitter Springs, their fate a mystery that folks had long stopped whispering about. John Slater was a simple horsebreaker, a man who understood animals better than most understood people. When he bought 3 stubborn donkeys at auction, he figured they'd be like any other ornery creatures he'd trained over the years. But these animals had a secret they desperately needed to share. Every single time John rode near the dry creek bed, they'd panic and drag him toward the same patch of dirt. What could make 3 animals act so strange for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun broke across the eastern ridge just as John Slater stepped out onto his porch, coffee cup warming his calloused hands. The air carried that particular bite of early autumn in Montana, crisp enough to see your breath, but holding the promise of a warm afternoon. He stood there in his worn flannel shirt and faded jeans, taking in the view that had greeted him for the better part of 30 years. His ranch wasn't much to speak of. 80 acres of scrubland with a weathered barn, a modest house his grandfather built in 1928, and a series of corrals that had seen better days. But it was his, paid for with sweat and patience, and that meant something. The screen door creaked behind him, a sound he'd been meaning to fix for months, but had come to find comforting in its familiarity. In the nearest corral, his 3 current clients, a paint mare, a sorrel gelding, and a young buckskin with trust issues, stood watching him with the kind of quiet expectation that comes from routine. Animals had always made more sense to John than people. They didn't lie, didn't pretend to be something they weren't. If a horse was scared, you saw it in every line of their body. If they trusted you, you felt it in the way they'd rest their weight against your shoulder. John Slater had earned his reputation the hard way, one difficult horse at a time. Folks from 3 counties over brought him their problem animals. The biters, the kickers, the ones who'd been ruined by rough handling or born with a wildness that needed understanding rather than breaking. He never advertised, never needed to. Word of mouth carried his name from ranch to ranch, barn to barn. That Slater fellow has a gift, they'd say. Takes his time, never forces it. Got a way about him that settles even the most troubled horse. The truth was simpler than any gift. John had learned patience from his father, a tall, quiet man who'd taught him that animals respond to calm consistency, not domination. The old leather training halter still hung in the barn, cracked and darkened with age and oil from countless hands. His father had used that halter on dozens of horses, and John had watched him work magic with nothing more than soft words and steady pressure. When his father passed 15 years ago, John had retired the halter, hanging it on a nail where he could see it every morning. It reminded him who he was, where he came from, and what mattered. The last 5 years had been lonely ones. Margaret's death from cancer had hollowed out the house in ways he was still discovering. They'd never had children, something they'd both wanted, but the good Lord had decided otherwise. Now, at 57, John found himself wondering what would happen to this place when he was gone. Who would remember the work done here? The horses saved from bad situations, the careful preservation of his father's methods. These were thoughts that came in the quiet hours, the kind of reflections a man of his years couldn't avoid. Money had gotten tight. The ranch work alone wasn't enough anymore, not with feed prices climbing and the truck needing a new transmission he couldn't quite afford. He'd started taking any training job that came along, even the ones that barely covered expenses. Pride was a luxury he could no longer maintain. The mortgage was paid off at least, but property taxes and basic upkeep consumed what little income he generated. He'd considered selling off some acreage, but the thought of strangers building on land his grandfather had worked felt like a betrayal. His morning routine never varied. After coffee on the porch, he'd walk the fence line, checking for damage from the previous night. Deer liked to push through near the northeast corner, and last winter, a fallen pine had taken out 20 feet of wire he'd had to replace. The physical work felt good, kept him strong and purposeful. By 7 o'clock, he'd be in the barn, feeding and checking on whichever horses were currently in his care. This particular morning, the paint mare nickered softly as he approached with hay. She'd arrived 3 weeks ago, terrified of ropes after someone had used one to drag her into a trailer. John had spent patient hours just sitting in her corral, letting her investigate him on her own terms. Yesterday, she'd finally allowed him to loop a soft cotton lead around her neck. Small victories, but they added up to transformation, given enough time. "Morning, lady," he said quietly, distributing hay between the 3 corrals. "We'll try the halter today. See how you feel about it." The buckskin, a 2-year-old colt with good bloodlines but a nervous disposition, paced the far side of his pen. His owner had started him too young, pushed him too fast, and created a horse that associated people with stress. John had been working on basic ground manners, teaching the young horse that humans could be predictable and safe. It would take months, maybe longer, but the colt was worth the effort. After morning chores, John climbed into his 1995 Ford pickup, 200,000 miles and counting, and headed into Bitter Springs. The town sat in a valley carved by the Bitterroot River, population hovering around 3,000, depending on the season. Main Street looked like it had been frozen in time around 1950, with false front buildings housing the feed store, hardware shop, 2 bars, a diner, and the bank that had financed 3 generations of ranchers through hard times. Clem Hodges ran the feed store, a converted livery stable that still smelled faintly of horses beneath the sweet scent of alfalfa and grain. Clem had known John since they were boys, back when they'd competed in junior rodeo together. Where John had found his calling with horses, Clem had discovered a talent for business. The feed store prospered even when ranchers struggled, selling necessities that folks couldn't do without. "John Slater, right on schedule," Clem called out, as the bell above the door announced his arrival. "Let me guess, 50 pounds of sweet feed and a salt block." "You know me too well," John replied, managing a smile. "Throw in some of that hoof supplement, too. The buckskin's got a crack in his left front, I'm watching." While Clem loaded the supplies, the 2 men fell into the comfortable rhythm of old friends who didn't need to fill every silence with talk. Eventually, Clem mentioned the auction scheduled for that afternoon at the fairgrounds. "Might be worth your time," Clem said. "Heard they're selling off old man Patterson's stock. He moved to Arizona for his lungs. Got a few horses, some equipment, odds and ends." John hadn't planned on attending, but curiosity pulled at him. Patterson had run a decent operation, and there might be something useful in the lot. More than that, he admitted to himself, it gave him a reason to be around people for a few hours, to feel connected to the community in a way that living alone sometimes made difficult. The auction started at 2 o'clock under a cloudless sky, the kind of afternoons that made you grateful for Montana's big sky country. Ranchers and their wives gathered around the auction ring, examining livestock and equipment with practiced eyes. John recognized most of the faces. This was a small community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, for better or worse. Mayor Garrison Webb stood near the auctioneer's platform, shaking hands and smiling that politician's smile he'd perfected over the years. Webb had been mayor for the past 8 years, winning in a landslide both times he'd run. Before politics, he'd worked as a guide, leading hunting parties and tourists through the mountains. Smart investments in real estate during the boom years had made him wealthy, and he'd used that wealth to position himself as Bitter Springs' leading citizen. He'd donated money for a new school gymnasium, sponsored the 4th of July celebration, and made sure his name appeared on every civic improvement. John had always found Webb a bit too smooth, too calculated in his generosity, but he kept those opinions to himself. The man had never done him any harm, and in small towns, you learned to get along with people, even if you didn't particularly care for them. The auction moved through its lots with efficient speed. Horses sold for decent prices, tack and equipment found new owners, and John watched with the detachment of someone who couldn't afford to bid. Then the auctioneer brought out 3 donkeys, 2 jennies and a jack, all of them looking rough and underfed. "Now, I'll be honest with you folks," the auctioneer said with a laugh. "These 3 are a package deal, and they're more trouble than they're worth, but somebody might find a use for them. Let's start the bidding at $50 for all 3. Silence greeted the offer. Donkeys weren't popular in cattle country, seen as stubborn and difficult. These 3 looked particularly unpromising. Shaggy coats, overgrown hooves, and a wildness in their eyes that suggested they'd been neglected for some time. Something in John stirred as he looked at them. Maybe it was the way they huddled together, seeking comfort from each other. Maybe it was the challenge of taking on animals everyone else had dismissed. Or maybe it was simply that he saw himself in their abandonment, undervalued, overlooked, but still possessing worth if someone took the time to look. $50, John heard himself say. The auctioneer looked relieved. "Sold to John Slater. And good luck to you, John. You're going to need it." Laughter rippled through the crowd, good-natured, but tinged with the certainty that he'd just made a foolish purchase. John paid his $50 and arranged to pick up the donkeys the following morning. Driving home, he wondered what Margaret would have said about this impulse. She'd had a soft spot for strays, too, whether animal or human. Maybe that's why they'd been so well matched. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple, John stood in his barn preparing a corral for the new arrivals. Doc Brennan, the local veterinarian, stopped by with some vaccination supplies John had ordered. "Heard you bought Patterson's donkeys," Doc said, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "Those animals have been passed around for years. Nobody can do anything with them." "Figured they deserved a chance," John replied. "How bad can they be?" Doc Brennan shook his head. "Patterson got them in a trade about 5 years ago. Couldn't train them worth a damn. Before that, they belonged to the Morrison place. And before that, well, nobody remembers. They've got a reputation for being impossible. Won't load in a trailer without a fight, won't take a halter, won't let you trim their feet. Stubborn doesn't begin to describe it. Every animal can be reached," John said with more confidence than he felt. "Just takes the right approach. Your funeral," Doc said. But his tone was affectionate. "If anyone can gentle them, it's you. Just don't expect miracles." After Doc left, John sat on his porch as darkness settled over the ranch. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with ancient light. These were the moments when the loneliness pressed hardest, when the empty chair beside him seemed to echo with Margaret's absence. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, new purposes, 3 donkeys that nobody wanted, and a man who'd built his life on patience and second chances. It seemed like a fitting match. John finished his coffee, rinsed the cup in the kitchen sink, and headed to bed. Morning would come early, as it always did, and with it the next chapter of a story he couldn't yet imagine. In town, lights glowed in the windows of the houses along Main Street. Mayor Webb's home, the finest in Bitter Springs, sat on a hill overlooking the valley. Inside, the mayor poured himself an expensive whiskey and gazed out at the town he'd helped build into prosperity. Everything had worked out exactly as he'd planned, and his past was buried deep enough that it would never surface. Some secrets, he believed, were meant to stay hidden forever. He had no way of knowing that 3 animals had been waiting a decade to prove him wrong. The morning arrived with a blanket of fog that clung to the valley floor like cotton batting. John was already at the fairgrounds by 7, his trailer hitched and ready. The 3 donkeys stood in a temporary pen, watching his approach with intelligent, wary eyes. Up close, they looked even more neglected than he'd first thought. Their hooves curled upward at the tips, indicating months without proper trimming. Burrs matted their coats, and ribs showed through their rough hair. But beneath the neglect, John could see good bone structure and a certain dignity in how they carried themselves. The larger Jenny, grey with a distinctive white blaze down her face, positioned herself between John and the other two. Protective behavior, he noted. The second Jenny was smaller, a rich brown color, with gentle eyes that held a sadness John recognized. The Jack stood at the back, black as coal with a white muzzle, his ears constantly swiveling to track every sound. They moved as a unit, never more than a few feet apart from each other. Loading them took 2 hours and the help of 3 fairground workers. The donkeys resisted with a determination that went beyond normal animal stubbornness. They braced their legs, backed away from the ramp, and vocalized their displeasure with braying that echoed across the empty fairgrounds. But John knew how to read animals, knew when to press and when to give them space. Eventually, with patience and a trail of sweet feed, he coaxed all 3 into the trailer. The drive back to the ranch took 20 minutes along winding country roads. John kept the speed down, talking softly to the animals through the open rear window of the truck cab. "It's all right now," he said. "You're going to a place where somebody gives a damn about you. That's worth something, isn't it?" Unloading proved easier than loading. The donkeys practically burst from the trailer, clearly relieved to have solid ground beneath their feet again. John guided them into the corral he'd prepared, made sure they had fresh water and hay, then stepped back to observe. This was his standard approach: give new animals time to settle, to understand they were safe, before attempting any real work. For the rest of that day and the next, John simply went about his regular routine, allowing the donkeys to adjust to their new surroundings. He worked with the paint mare, who finally accepted a halter without fear. He exercised the buckskin on a long line, building the young horse's confidence through repetition and calm handling. Between sessions, he'd lean against the donkey's corral fence, speaking to them in that low, steady voice he'd inherited from his father. "You 3 have a story, don't you?" he said on the 3rd morning, watching them investigate every corner of their enclosure. "Been through something that marked you. I can see it in how you stay close to each other. But that's over now. Whatever happened before, this is a fresh start." The grey Jenny with the blaze, John had started calling her Grace, approached the fence first. She stretched her neck out, nostrils flaring as she took in his scent. When he didn't move, she came closer, eventually allowing him to scratch behind her ears. Small victories. The brown Jenny, whom he'd named Hope for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, followed Grace's lead within the hour. The black Jack, steadfast, remained cautious, but watched everything with those intelligent eyes. By the end of the first week, John had made real progress. The donkeys allowed him into their corral, let him handle their legs, and stood quietly while he began the long process of trimming their overgrown hooves. Their coats started to shine under daily grooming, and they'd put on weight from regular feeding. More importantly, they'd begun to trust him. Grace would follow him around the corral, and Hope had developed a habit of resting her head on his shoulder while he worked. On the 8th day, John decided to try something new. He'd ride his saddle horse, Buck, around the property with the donkeys loose in the larger pasture. Buck was an old gelding, steady and reliable, who'd been John's companion for 12 years. If the donkeys were going to be useful for anything, packing supplies on mountain trails maybe, or keeping coyotes away from the other stock, they needed to learn to move with other animals. He opened the corral gate and let the 3 donkeys into the main pasture, a 15-acre section that included the dry creek bed running along the eastern boundary. Buck stood saddled and ready, ears pricked forward with curiosity at these unusual companions. John mounted up, settled into the familiar creak of leather, and nudged Buck into an easy walk. For the first 10 minutes, everything went smoothly. The donkeys followed at a distance, investigating their expanded territory with obvious pleasure. Grace rolled in a dust patch, coat rippling with satisfaction. Hope discovered a patch of clover and grazed contentedly. Steadfast kept watch, but his posture had relaxed considerably. Then John guided Buck toward the eastern fence line near the dry creek bed. He wanted to check a section of wire he'd noticed sagging the previous week. The moment Buck's hooves turned in that direction, the atmosphere changed. Grace's head shot up, ears pinned flat against her skull. She released a bray that sounded almost human in its urgency, a sound of pure distress that made the hair on John's neck stand up. Hope and Steadfast immediately joined in, their voices creating a chorus of alarm that spooked Buck into a nervous sidestep. "Easy, boy," John said, trying to calm his horse while watching the donkey's strange behavior. All three animals had gone rigid, staring toward the creek bed with an intensity that seemed wrong, unnatural. Grace took 3 steps forward, then stopped, her whole body trembling. John had worked with enough animals to know genuine fear when he saw it. This wasn't stubbornness or orneriness. This was terror mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite identify. It looked almost like determination, as if the donkeys were fighting against their own fear to move toward something they desperately needed to reach. "What is it?" John asked, knowing they couldn't answer but unable to stop himself from speaking. "What's got you so worked up?" He dismounted, dropping Buck's reins in a ground tie the old horse would respect. Moving slowly, John approached the donkeys. Grace turned to look at him, and the expression in her eyes stopped him cold. Animals didn't look at humans that way. With such clear intelligence, such obvious need to communicate something vitally important. Grace moved toward the creek bed, took 3 steps, then turned back to look at John. She repeated this behavior twice more, a pattern so deliberate it couldn't be coincidence. She was trying to lead him somewhere. Hope and Steadfast flanked her, adding their own urgent vocalizations to her silent plea. John had heard stories about animals behaving strangely before earthquakes or storms, sensing things humans couldn't. He'd seen dogs refuse to cross certain ground that later proved to be riddled with old mine shafts. But he'd never experienced anything quite like this. 3 animals with such focused, persistent urgency about a specific location. Against his better judgment, he decided to follow them. He remounted Buck and gave the gelding his head, letting the donkeys take the lead. They moved directly toward the dry creek bed, their earlier fear seemingly overridden by whatever drove them forward. When they reached the edge, where summer-dried grass gave way to sand and scattered rocks, they stopped. Grace walked to a spot about 20 yards from where John sat on Buck. There was nothing remarkable about the location, just a slight mound of dirt and some scrub brush, indistinguishable from a dozen other spots along the creek. But Grace planted herself there and refused to move. She pawed at the ground with her front hoof, sending up small clouds of dust. Hope joined her, both animals now digging at the earth with increasing agitation. Steadfast came to John, something he'd never done before. The black Jack walked right up to Buck's side and grabbed John's leather chaps in his teeth, not biting but holding firm, tugging with clear purpose. He was trying to pull John toward the spot where the jennies dug. "All right," John said, more disturbed than he wanted to admit. "All right, I'm coming." He dismounted again and let Steadfast lead him forward, the donkey still gripping his chaps. When they reached the mound, the Jack finally released his hold and stepped back, waiting. All 3 donkeys stood in a semicircle around that unremarkable patch of ground, their bodies tense with expectation. John looked down at the dirt, then back at the animals. Their behavior had gone far beyond anything he could explain through normal understanding of livestock. These weren't simple creatures reacting to instinct. They were trying to tell him something, show him something that mattered desperately to them. The rational part of his mind said to leave it alone, to guide the animals away from whatever spooked them and forget this ever happened. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime learning to listen to what animals couldn't say with words, told him this was important. These 3 donkeys had been waiting for someone to understand, to pay attention, to finally see what they'd been trying to show people for years. John walked back to Buck and retrieved the small folding shovel he kept in his saddlebag for clearing trail obstacles. He'd dig down a few feet, prove to the donkeys there was nothing there but dirt and rocks, and put an end to this strange episode. It was probably a dead coyote or a hibernating snake that had them worked up. Nothing that warranted this level of distress. The sun had climbed higher, warming his back as he returned to the spot. The 3 donkeys watched him with an intensity that felt almost human. John pushed the shovel into the dry earth, felt it bite through the packed soil, and began to dig. He expected to hit bedrock within a few feet. The creek bed had always been shallow in this section. Instead, after 2 feet of digging, the shovel struck something that rang hollow, not rock, wood. Old, rotted wood that crumbled at the impact. John's heart began to beat faster. He enlarged the hole, working carefully now, and within minutes had exposed a section of what looked like weathered planking, the kind used in wagon construction. The donkeys had gone completely still, silent for the first time since this had all begun. They stood like statues, watching John uncover what they'd known was there all along, and in that moment, standing in a hole with ancient wood exposed beneath his feet, and 3 donkeys bearing witness, John Slater understood that his quiet, predictable life had just shifted onto a path he could never have imagined. John stood in the growing hole, staring at the rotted wood beneath his boots, trying to make sense of what he'd found. The logical explanation was that someone had dumped old lumber here years ago, maybe even decades back. The creek probably flooded periodically, covering the debris with sediment over time. But that explanation didn't account for the donkeys' behavior, their desperate insistence that he dig in this exact spot. He expanded the hole carefully, working in the methodical way his father had taught him to approach any task. The wood extended in both directions, forming what looked increasingly like a roof or covering of some kind. It was old, that much was certain. The planks were grey with age, splitting along the grain, some pieces so deteriorated they disintegrated when he touched them. After an hour of work, John had cleared an area roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the autumn chill. His back ached from bending, and his hands had developed new blisters despite decades of calluses. The donkeys hadn't moved, maintaining their vigil with a patience that seemed both remarkable and unsettling. Through gaps in the collapsed wood, John could see darkness below. Not just the darkness of packed earth, but an actual void, a space beneath the ground. His pulse quickened. This wasn't dumped lumber. This was a structure, something deliberately built and then buried, either by design or by nature. He needed better tools, more help, and probably should contact the county sheriff, but something held him back from that last thought. The donkey's behavior suggested this discovery was deeply personal to them, connected to their strange history in ways he didn't understand yet. If he brought in authorities now, before he knew what this was, the animals might never get whatever resolution they'd been seeking for who knew how long. John rode Buck back to the barn, the donkeys following without prompting. He put the horse away, then returned to the house to gather better equipment, a proper shovel, his pickaxe, work gloves, and a flashlight. He also grabbed a canteen of water and some beef jerky. Whatever this was, he was committed to uncovering it. By early afternoon, he'd cleared away most of the rotted wood. What emerged was unmistakable. A wagon, or what remained of one, buried approximately 8 feet below the current ground level. The wood roof had been the canvas covering, supported by bows that had collapsed inward. The wagon bed itself seemed relatively intact, protected by the earth that had covered it. John rigged a simple pulley system using rope and a sturdy fence post, then carefully lowered himself into the excavation. The smell hit him immediately. Old, musty air that hadn't circulated in years, mixed with something else, something organic and long decayed. He clicked on the flashlight and played it across the wagon's interior. What he saw made him climb out of the hole immediately, heart hammering against his ribs. He sat on the edge, head between his knees, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He'd seen death before, animals mostly, but also his share of hunting accidents and ranch mishaps over the years. This was different. This was human remains, and not just one set. Inside the wagon were bones, skulls, the unmistakable evidence of people who died here in this buried wagon and had never been found. 3 adults and 2 children, based on what he could see in the brief moment before he'd retreated. His mind raced through possibilities. A tragedy during a creek flood? A family caught in a flash storm and buried alive? But wagons didn't bury themselves 8 feet down. This had been deliberate. The donkeys stood at the edge of the hole, looking down at him. Grace made a soft sound, not quite a bray, more like a question. In her eyes, John saw something that looked like relief mixed with sorrow. These animals knew. Somehow they'd known all along what was buried here. He needed to contact Sheriff Morrison. There was no avoiding it now. This was a crime scene, or at the very least, a historical tragedy that needed proper investigation. But first, John needed to understand more. He forced himself to descend into the hole again, this time prepared for what he'd find. The wagon interior had been surprisingly well preserved by the dry Montana soil. Among the bones and rotted fabric, John could make out personal belongings. A woman's hair comb, still showing traces of tortoise shell. A child's toy, carved from wood in the shape of a horse. Cooking implements, a cast-iron pan, some tin cups. These people had been traveling, clearly heading west like so many others in the 1800s. In the corner, wedged between the wagon bed and what remained of a trunk, John spotted something that had survived the years remarkably well. A leather-bound journal, protected from moisture by its position and the oilcloth someone had wrapped around it. His hands trembled as he carefully extracted it from its resting place. The leather was stiff and cracked, but intact. John carried it out of the hole and sat in the grass, the 3 donkeys gathering around him like concerned family members. He opened the journal with extreme care, mindful that the pages might crumble at his touch. The first page bore an inscription in careful, faded handwriting. The Travel Journal of Thomas Brennan, April 1884. The date made John's breath catch. 1884. These people had been here, buried, and forgotten for over 140 years. The name Brennan seemed familiar, tugging at his memory, but he couldn't quite place why. He turned pages slowly, reading entries that documented a family's journey west. Thomas Brennan, his wife, Sarah, their 2 children, Emma and James, and Sarah's brother, Robert. They'd sold their farm in Missouri, converted everything to gold and cash, and set out for Montana Territory, with dreams of starting a ranch where land was still affordable and opportunity abundant. The entries grew increasingly excited as they neared their destination. Thomas wrote about hiring a guide in the last town before Bitter Springs, a young man named Garrison, who knew the territory and promised to lead them safely through the mountain passes. He seems capable and honest, Thomas had written. Charges a fair rate and knows these mountains like the back of his hand. John felt cold spread through his chest. Garrison. The guide's name was Garrison. Mayor Garrison Webb had worked as a guide before entering politics, but that would make him, John did quick math, around 70 now, if he'd been a young man in 1884. The timeline was wrong. Unless he flipped through more pages, heart racing now. The final entries grew darker. Thomas wrote about Garrison leading them off the main trail, claiming he knew a shortcut. The guide had become increasingly nervous, looking over his shoulder, asking strange questions about their finances and whether anyone knew their exact route. The last entry, written in a shaking hand that suggested haste or fear, was dated June 15th, 1884. Garrison has led us into a box canyon. There is no way forward, and he blocks the way back. Sarah is frightened. The children sense our fear. I do not know his intentions, but I fear we have made a terrible mistake trusting this man. If anyone finds this journal, Know that we were the Brennan family of Springfield, Missouri, and we meant no harm to anyone. We only wanted—" The entry ended mid-sentence. Whatever happened next had prevented Thomas Brennan from finishing his final written thoughts. John's hands shook as he closed the journal. Doc Brennan, the veterinarian. His last name was Brennan. Could there be a connection? He needed to talk to Doc, needed to understand the family history. But first, he had to process what this journal was saying. If he was reading this correctly, and if the guide named Garrison was who John suspected, then Mayor Garrison Webb hadn't made his fortune through smart investments and hard work. He'd stolen it from a family he'd murdered and buried in the wilderness, and somehow, impossibly, 3 donkeys had carried this secret for more than a century, waiting for someone who would finally listen to what they had to say. The donkeys stood watching him, their expressions solemn and knowing. Grace stepped forward and gently nuzzled John's shoulder. In that gesture, he felt their gratitude, their relief that the burden they'd carried for so long might finally be lifted. But he also felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his own shoulders. What he did next would determine whether justice could still be served after 140 years of silence. John sat in the fading afternoon light, the journal resting in his lap like a live grenade. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him from all directions. Part of him wanted to call the sheriff immediately, to hand over this terrible knowledge to someone whose job it was to deal with such things. But another part, the part that had learned to think things through before acting, knew he needed to be absolutely certain before making accusations that would tear apart the town's most prominent citizen. He carefully wrapped the journal back in its protective oilcloth and carried it to the house, the donkeys trailing behind him like faithful guardians. Inside, he placed it on the kitchen table and forced himself to eat something. Though food tasted like sawdust in his mouth, his mind kept returning to the bones in that wagon, to the children who'd died without knowing why, to parents who'd trusted the wrong person with their family's safety. After eating, John pulled out his laptop, a concession to modern life he'd made reluctantly a few years back, and began searching for information about the Brennan family. Historical records for 1880s Montana Territory were spotty at best, but he found references to missing persons cases that had never been solved. The Brennan family was mentioned in a newspaper article from 1885, listed among several groups who'd disappeared while traveling west. The article noted they'd left Missouri with substantial assets, intending to purchase land in Montana. Then he searched for Garrison Webb. The mayor's official biography, posted on the town website, claimed he was 62 years old, born in 1963. That would have made it impossible for him to be the guide who'd led the Brennans to their deaths. Unless, and this thought made John's stomach turn, unless the current Garrison Webb was the son or grandson of the original Garrison, carrying on both the name and the terrible secret. The family connection made sense. Garrison Webb Sr. could have committed the murders, stolen the fortune, and built his life on that blood money. When he died, he might have passed everything to his son or grandson, along with the truth about where the wealth really came from. The current mayor might be an accomplice after the fact, benefiting from crimes he hadn't personally committed, but certainly knew about. John needed more information, needed to talk to someone who understood the town's history better than he did. The obvious choice was Doc Brennan. If the murdered family had any surviving descendants, Doc might be one of them, though he'd never mentioned any connection to people who'd disappeared in 1884. Then again, why would he? Most folks didn't know their family trees back that far, especially when branches had been cut off by tragedy. The phone call went to voicemail. Doc was probably out on a call, tending to someone's livestock. John left a message asking Doc to stop by when he had a chance, saying he'd found something interesting on his property and wanted Doc's opinion on it. Vague enough not to alarm him, specific enough to pique his curiosity. While waiting, John returned to the excavation site with a tarp and rope. He couldn't leave the remains exposed, but he also didn't want to disturb the scene any further. He rigged the tarp as a protective covering, anchored it with stakes, and marked the area clearly so he wouldn't accidentally disturb it with equipment or livestock. The 3 donkeys had followed him back to the creek bed. They seemed calmer now, less agitated than they'd been since arriving at the ranch. Grace actually allowed him to put a halter on her without resistance, and Hope rested her head against his back while he worked. It was as if they understood that the secret was out now, that their long vigil was entering its final phase. "You 3 are the only witnesses," John said aloud, scratching steadfast behind the ears. "You saw what happened, didn't you? You belong to that family. You were there when it all went wrong." The impossibility of that statement hung in the air. Donkeys lived 25 to 30 years on average, maybe 40 in exceptional cases. For these animals to have been present at the Brennan murders in 1884, they'd have to be over 140 years old. It was absurd, impossible, contrary to every biological law John understood. Yet he couldn't shake the certainty that somehow, in some way he couldn't explain, these 3 donkeys were connected to those long-dead travelers, the way they'd known exactly where to lead him, their desperate insistence that he'd dig in that precise spot, their obvious relief now that the truth was emerging. It all pointed to a connection that transcended normal understanding. Doc Brennan arrived just before sunset, his truck rattling up the drive with a distinctive knock in the engine that he'd been promising to fix for months. He climbed out, medical bag in hand, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Got your message," Doc said. "What's this interesting discovery you mentioned?" John had rehearsed this conversation in his head a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt inadequate. "I need to ask you something first. Your family, the Brennans, have they always been in Montana?" Doc's expression shifted to puzzlement. "Far as I know, my great-grandfather settled here in the late 1800s, started the first veterinary practice in the territory." "Why do you ask?" "What was his first name?" "Robert. Robert Brennan." "John, what's this about?" "Robert, Sarah's brother, according to the journal. But the journal indicated Robert had died with the family. Unless," John's mind raced through possibilities, "unless Robert had survived somehow. Maybe he'd been away from camp when the attack happened. Maybe he'd escaped and lived to establish himself in Bitter Springs, never speaking of the tragedy that had taken his sister and her family." "I found something on my property," John said slowly. "Something I think you need to see. But I want to prepare you. It's going to be disturbing, and it might relate to your family history in ways you don't expect." Doc's face grew serious. He'd known John long enough to understand that this wasn't a joke or exaggeration. "Show me." They walked to the creek bed in silence, the 3 donkeys following at a respectful distance. When they reached the tarp-covered excavation, John explained what he'd found. The buried wagon, the remains, the journal with its terrible final entries. He watched Doc's face carefully as he spoke, saw the color drain from the older man's cheeks. "Robert Brennan was your great-grandfather," John said gently. "According to this journal, he traveled west with his sister Sarah, her husband Thomas, and their 2 children. They hired a guide named Garrison to lead them through the mountains." Doc sat heavily on a nearby rock, his hands trembling. "I knew some of this," he said quietly. "Family stories passed down. Great-grandfather Robert lost his sister and her family on the journey west. They were attacked by bandits. He always said he was out hunting when it happened. Came back to find them gone. Searched for weeks but never found them. The grief nearly destroyed him. He didn't tell the whole truth," John said. "Or maybe he couldn't face it. According to Thomas Brennan's journal, there were no bandits. Just a guide named Garrison who led them into a trap." Doc looked up sharply. "Garrison? As in—" "I don't know for certain," John interrupted. "The timeline doesn't match exactly. But I think we need to find out if our current mayor had a grandfather or great-grandfather with the same name who worked as a guide in 1884. They sat together as darkness fell. 2 men separated by years, but united by a mystery that connected their families across more than a century. The donkeys stood nearby, patient guardians of truth finally being brought to light. And somewhere in town, Mayor Garrison Webb went about his evening routine, unaware that the past he thought safely buried was about to rise from the earth and demand accounting. The next 3 days passed in a blur of research and careful planning. Doc Brennan, once he'd recovered from the initial shock, proved to be an invaluable ally. Together, they combed through county records, old newspapers on microfilm at the library, and genealogical databases. What they found painted a disturbing picture that grew clearer with each piece of evidence. Garrison Webb Sr. had indeed worked as a guide in the 1880s, establishing himself in Bitter Springs around 1885, just 1 year after the Brennan family disappeared. Property records showed he'd purchased a substantial parcel of land that same year, paying in gold coin. For a man who'd been working as a guide, a profession that rarely generated significant wealth, the sudden acquisition of property raised questions no one had thought to ask at the time. Garrison Sr. had married in 1886 and had one son, Garrison Jr., born in 1887. That son had followed in his father's footsteps, working initially as a guide before transitioning into land speculation. He'd had his own son, the current mayor, in 1963. 3 generations of Garrison Webbs, each building on the prosperity established by the first. The family's rise to prominence had been gradual but steady. Garrison Sr. had been well respected, known for his knowledge of the territory and his business acumen. His son had expanded the family holdings through shrewd investments. The current Garrison Webb had taken the family name into politics, presenting himself as a pillar of the community with deep roots in Bitter Springs history. What none of the official records mentioned, what had been carefully erased or never recorded, was how that initial prosperity had been funded. The Brennan family had carried their life savings with them. $10,000 in gold and currency, according to Thomas Brennan's journal entries. In 1884, that represented a small fortune, more than enough to buy land and establish a comfortable life. John and Doc sat in John's kitchen on the 3rd evening, documents spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle, finally coming together. The journal lay open to Thomas Brennan's final entry, a silent accusation, written in fading ink. "We need to contact the authorities," Doc said, not for the first time. "This is evidence of murder. I don't care how long ago it happened. There's no statute of limitations on murder." "I know," John replied, "but we need to be smart about this. Garrison Webb has influence in this county. The sheriff goes to his Christmas parties. The judge plays golf with him. If we go public with this before we have everything documented, before we're absolutely certain he could make it all disappear." "How do you make bones disappear?" Doc asked. "How do you explain away a journal written by one of the victims? He'll claim it's a hoax. He'll say we fabricated evidence to discredit him. Without DNA testing to prove those remains are actually the Brennan family, without more evidence connecting his great-grandfather to the crime, it becomes our word against his reputation." Doc nodded slowly, seeing the logic even as it frustrated him. "So, what do we do?" John had been thinking about this for 3 days, turning the problem over in his mind during every quiet moment. "We need to find out if Garrison Webb knows about his family's history. If he's been benefiting from stolen wealth his whole life, he might have documentation his great-grandfather left behind. Letters, a confession, something that proves the connection. And we need physical evidence from the crime scene that's irrefutable." "You want to search the mayor's house?" Doc looked shocked. "John, that's breaking and entering. That's illegal." "So was murder," John replied quietly. "So was stealing from a family and leaving their children to die. I'm not saying we rush into anything, but we need leverage before we go public, and that means knowing what cards Webb is holding." Before Doc could respond, headlights swept across the kitchen window. A vehicle was coming up the drive, unusual for this time of evening. John moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. Mayor Garrison Webb's distinctive black Lincoln Town car sat in his driveway, and the mayor himself was climbing out. "He's here," John said. "Webb is here." Doc moved to the table, quickly gathering up the documents and journal. "Hide these. Now." They worked fast, stuffing papers into drawers and cabinets. John grabbed the journal and shoved it into the freezer, beneath a package of venison. It wasn't a perfect hiding place, but it would have to do. By the time Webb knocked on the door, the kitchen looked normal. Just two men having coffee on an ordinary evening. John opened the door, working to keep his expression neutral. "Mayor Webb, this is unexpected." Webb's smile was practiced and warm, the expression of a man comfortable with his position in the community. "John, I apologize for the late visit. I was driving back from a meeting in Helena and thought I'd stop by. I heard you bought some donkeys at the Patterson auction, and I wanted to see how you were managing with them." Everything about the statement seemed innocuous, but alarm bells rang in John's head. Why would the mayor care about 3 cheap donkeys? How had he even heard about the purchase? And why drive out of his way to check on them? "They're settling in fine," John said carefully. "Learning to trust people again. Excellent, excellent." Webb's eyes swept past John into the kitchen, where Doc sat at the table. "Evening, Doc. How are things at the clinic?" "Busy as always," Doc replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Calving season keeps me running." Webb turned his attention back to John. "Those donkeys have quite a history, you know. Been passed around for years. Nobody could do anything with them. Strange animals. Almost like they're possessed or something." He laughed, but there was something forced about it. "You know where they came from originally?" "Can't say I do," John said, meeting Webb's eyes directly. "Does it matter?" "Probably not. Just curious. They've been in the area since I was a boy. My grandfather used to tell stories about 3 wild donkeys that roamed the countryside, always together, always causing trouble. Said they acted like they were looking for something." The casual mention of his grandfather felt deliberate, testing. John kept his expression neutral. "Animals do strange things sometimes. I've seen horses that wouldn't cross certain ground. Dogs that barked at empty corners. Probably nothing supernatural about it." "Of course not." Webb smiled again. "Well, I won't keep you. Just wanted to check in, see how things were going. If you have any trouble with those animals, let me know. I have connections with animal control, wildlife services. We could arrange to have them relocated if they prove too difficult." "I appreciate the offer," John said, "but I think we'll be fine." After Webb left, John and Doc stood in silence, watching the Lincoln's tail lights disappear down the road. Finally, Doc spoke, his voice shaken. "He knows something. The way he talked about those donkeys, about his grandfather, that wasn't casual conversation." "No," John agreed. "That was a warning. He's been watching, probably heard about me digging out by the creek bed. Maybe someone saw me and mentioned it in town. He came here to gauge how much we know and to remind us of his power." "What do we do now?" John moved to the freezer and retrieved the journal, holding it like the precious evidence it was. "Now we move faster. We document everything. We get those remains properly examined, and we find whatever evidence Webb's family kept. Because he just confirmed what I suspected. The current mayor knows exactly what his great-grandfather did, and he's willing to protect that secret." The 3 donkeys stood in their corral, visible through the kitchen window. Even in darkness, John could sense their watchfulness, their patient determination. They'd waited over a century for justice. He wouldn't let them down now. In town, Garrison Webb sat in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand, staring at old photographs on his desk. One showed his great-grandfather, Garrison Sr., standing proudly in front of the house he'd built with stolen gold. The mayor touched the photograph with one finger, his expression troubled. The past, he realized, wasn't as safely buried as he'd always believed. And those damned donkeys! His grandfather had tried to kill them 3 times, but they'd always escaped. Now they'd led someone to the wagon. It was time to take more direct action. John barely slept that night. Every sound from outside, the wind rattling the barn door, a coyote's distant call, the creak of settling wood, had him reaching for the shotgun he'd placed beside the bed. Webb's visit had changed everything, escalating the situation from historical mystery to present danger. A man didn't drive out of his way late at night to check on donkeys unless those animals represented a threat to something he valued. By first light, John was already up, checking on the donkeys and the covered excavation site. Everything appeared undisturbed, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He spent the morning installing motion sensor lights around the barn and the creek bed area. If anyone tried to tamper with the evidence, he'd at least have warning. Doc arrived at 9, looking as tired as John felt. Couldn't sleep either, he admitted. Kept thinking about my great-grandfather, about what he must have gone through. Losing his sister, his niece and nephew. Spending his whole life not knowing what really happened to them. He suspected, though, John said. Had to have. Why else settle in the same town as the guide who led them into the mountains? He stayed here watching Garrison Sr., trying to find proof, and never did. The secret died with the old man. Not quite. John gestured to the donkeys, who were watching the two men with their characteristic intensity. Robert Brennan might not have found justice, but he unknowingly left behind 3 witnesses who never forgot. They spent the morning photographing everything. The excavation site, the wagon remains, each page of the journal. Doc had brought a colleague from the State University, an anthropology professor named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in historical forensics. She'd asked no questions when Doc requested her help, just packed her equipment and made the drive. Dr. Chen approached the site with professional detachment, but John saw her expression change as she examined the remains. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "The preservation is remarkable given the timeline. The dry soil and depth of burial created conditions similar to archaeological sites I've worked in the Southwest." She carefully photographed and documented everything before removing several bone samples for analysis. "I can arrange for carbon dating and, if we can find living descendants, DNA comparison. The journal provides context, but physical evidence is what makes a case." "How long will testing take?" John asked. "Weeks for preliminary results, possibly months for comprehensive analysis, but I can provide a preliminary report within a few days, enough to establish that these remains are consistent with the time period described in the journal." After Dr. Chen left, promising discretion until they decided how to proceed, John and Doc returned to the house. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, illuminating the photocopied pages of the journal they'd spread across the table. "We need to know what Webb has," John said, returning to the subject they'd been dancing around. "Family records, documents from his great-grandfather, something that either proves the connection or gives him plausible deniability. You're still thinking about searching his house. It's not ideal, but I don't see another option. We go to the sheriff with what we have now, and Webb uses his influence to bury it. We wait for DNA results, and he has weeks to destroy evidence or construct a defense. We need to move while he's still uncertain about how much." "We know." Doc was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the decision. Finally he nodded. "If we do this, we do it smart. Webb's at the county commissioner meeting tomorrow night. Public record. Runs until at least 9 o'clock. His wife died 3 years ago. No live-in staff. The house should be empty. You've thought about this. I spent all night thinking about it. My great-grandfather deserves to know the truth about what happened to his sister, even if he's been gone for 90 years. And those people in the wagon deserve justice, even if it comes more than a century late." They planned carefully. John would handle the actual entry. His military service in the 90s had included some training he preferred not to think about, but could apply here. Doc would serve as lookout and driver. They'd wear gloves, take only photographs of anything they found, and be in and out within 30 minutes. The next evening arrived too quickly. John felt the familiar pre-mission tension he remembered from his army days, the combination of focused alertness and controlled fear. They drove past Webb's house twice, confirming no vehicles in the drive and no lights visible. The commissioner meeting was running according to schedule, with Webb prominent in the proceedings, according to Doc's text contact at the county building. John approached the house from the back, moving with practiced stealth through the manicured yard. The back door featured a standard lock that yielded to the tools he'd brought, another skill he'd learned in service and never expected to use as a civilian. The alarm panel inside showed armed, but it was an older system, the kind that gave you 60 seconds to enter a code. John clipped the phone line, silencing the automatic call-out, then carefully pried open the panel and disconnected the backup battery. Not elegant, but effective. The house interior was exactly what he'd expected. Expensive furnishings, Western art on the walls, everything tasteful and curated to project success and permanence. He moved quickly through the first floor, looking for a study or office. He found it off the main hallway, a wood-paneled room with a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. John pulled on cotton gloves and began a systematic search. Modern documents first, financial records, correspondence, anything that might reference the family history. He photographed everything with his phone, working quickly but thoroughly. Then he turned his attention to the older materials. A locked drawer in the desk yielded to his picks. Inside, he found what looked like a family Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. Opening it carefully, John saw entries in faded ink, documenting births, marriages, and deaths going back to the 1800s. Garrison Webb Sr.'s entry listed his birth as 1862 in Missouri. The entry was in the same handwriting as most of the others, suggesting it had been transcribed from memory or older records. But something about it bothered John. The ink looked different, slightly darker, as if it had been added later. He kept searching. In the back of the bottom drawer, hidden beneath old tax documents, he found a smaller leather-bound book. No, not a book. Another journal. This one bore no name on the cover, but opening it revealed an entry dated March 1920, written in an elderly man's shaking hand. "I am dying, and I must record the truth, even if it damns me in the eyes of God and man. In 1884, I committed an act that has haunted my every day since. I led the Brennan family to their deaths for money, and I have built my life on their blood." John's hands trembled as he photographed each page. This was it, the confession they needed. Garrison Sr. had written it all down in his final days. How he'd guided the Brennans into an isolated canyon. How he'd killed Thomas and Robert when they tried to fight back. How Sarah and the children had begged for their lives before he'd shot them too. How he'd taken their gold and buried the wagon with the bodies inside, covering it with enough dirt that flash floods would eventually bury it deeper. The confession detailed everything: amounts stolen, where the money went, how he'd established himself in Bitter Springs, and at the end, a note to his son. "I leave you wealth, but it is stained with innocent blood. I pray you use it better than I earned it. Destroy this confession, or it will destroy everything we've built." Obviously, his son hadn't destroyed it. He'd kept it, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as a reminder of the family's dark foundation. And his son had kept it too, the current mayor either unable or unwilling to purge this damning evidence of his family's original sin. John photographed the last page and was about to replace the journal when he heard the sound that sent ice through his veins. A car door closing in the driveway. He moved to the window and saw Webb's Lincoln parked outside. The commissioner meeting must have ended early. He had perhaps 30 seconds before Webb entered the house. John replaced the journals exactly as he'd found them, closed the drawer, and moved toward the back door. He could hear a key in the front lock as he slipped through the kitchen. The back door clicked shut just as lights came on in the front hall. John pressed himself against the side of the house, barely breathing. Through the window, he could see Webb moving through the house, heading straight for the study. Had he noticed something? Did the alarm system send a silent alert despite the cutoff? Webb stood in the study doorway for a long moment, his body language tense. Then he moved to the desk, checking the locked drawer. John couldn't tell if Webb noticed any disturbance, but the mayor's expression was troubled. He pulled out the confession journal stared at it for several seconds, then returned it to its hiding place. John waited until Webb moved, deeper into the house, then crept across the yard to where Doc waited with the truck 3 blocks away. Neither man spoke until they were safely on the road back to John's ranch. "Did you find anything?" Doc finally asked. "Everything," John replied. "We found everything we need." But as he described the confession journal and the photographs on his phone, a new problem became clear. They had evidence, solid evidence, but it was obtained illegally. A defense attorney would have it thrown out in seconds. They needed another approach, a way to use what they'd learned without revealing how they'd learned it. The solution, when it came to John, was both simple and risky. They wouldn't use the confession directly. Instead, they'd use the information in it to guide legal searches, to point authorities toward evidence that could be obtained properly, and they'd apply public pressure that would make it impossible for Webb to simply bury the truth. It was time to bring in Sheriff Morrison, Dr. Chen, and anyone else who could help ensure that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. The donkeys had waited 140 years. John could give them just a little while longer to see this through properly. Sheriff Tom Morrison sat in John's kitchen, his weathered face unreadable as he listened to the story. John had known Morrison for 20 years. A fair man, honest, but also someone who understood political realities in a small county. Accusing the mayor of benefiting from a century-old murder would require ironclad evidence and careful handling. "Let me make sure I understand," Morrison said slowly. "You're telling me that 3 donkeys led you to a buried wagon containing the remains of 5 people who disappeared in 1884, and you believe those people were murdered by Mayor Webb's great-grandfather?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," John replied. "Doc, show him the journal." Doc placed the photocopied pages on the table. Morrison read through them carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he sat back heavily in his chair. This is extraordinary, if it's authentic. Dr. Sarah Chen from the State University has examined the remains," Doc said. "She's confirmed they're consistent with the 1880s time frame. Carbon dating is in progress, but a preliminary assessment supports everything in that journal. And you're a descendant of one of the victims," Morrison said to Doc. "Robert Brennan was your great-grandfather. He was the only survivor, yes. He lost his sister and her entire family. Spent his whole life not knowing what really happened to them." Morrison turned to John. "These donkeys, you're sure they led you to this exact spot? They didn't just wander near it by chance?" John described the animals' behavior in detail. Their panic, their determination, their physical insistence that he'd dig in that specific location. "Sheriff, I've worked with animals my entire life. What those 3 did wasn't random or instinctive. They knew something was there, and they were desperate for someone to find it. Donkeys don't live 140 years, Morrison said flatly. I know that. I can't explain it, but I also can't deny what I witnessed. Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the corrals where the 3 donkeys stood watching the house. After a long silence, he turned back. Even if everything you're saying is true, and I'm not doubting you, I'm just being realistic. We have a significant problem. Webb has been mayor for 8 years. His family has been prominent in this county for generations. Accusations like this could tear this community apart. The truth is the truth, Doc said quietly. Those people deserve justice, no matter how inconvenient it is. I agree, but we need to do this right. We need evidence that's absolutely unimpeachable. We need... Morrison stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he looked past John toward the window. John turned to see what had caught the sheriff's attention. A white SUV had pulled into the driveway, a news van from the regional television station in Missoula. Behind it came 2 more vehicles, including one marked with the logo of a statewide newspaper. What the hell? John moved to the door as reporters began climbing out, cameras and recording equipment in hand. A woman in her 30s approached, microphone ready. Mr. Slater? I'm Jennifer Martinez from KTMF News. We received an anonymous tip about a major historical discovery on your property. Can you confirm you found evidence related to the Brennan family disappearance of 1884? John's mind raced. He hadn't contacted the media. Doc looked equally surprised. That meant someone else had, someone who wanted this story public before they could control the narrative. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his voice firm. This is private property and an active investigation. I'm going to have to ask all of you to leave. Sheriff Morrison, is it true that the remains of 5 people have been found? Another reporter called out. Does this relate to Mayor Webb's family history? The situation was spiraling out of control. More vehicles were arriving, including several local residents drawn by the commotion. John saw Clem from the feed store, the diner owner, and others from town. Within minutes, his quiet ranch had become the center of a media circus. Morrison pulled John aside. Who knew about this besides us and Dr. Chen? No one. We were careful. Someone talked, or Morrison's expression hardened. Someone wanted to force our hand, get this out in the open before we could present it properly. Through the growing crowd, John spotted a figure standing apart from the others, watching with calculated interest. Mayor Garrison Webb had arrived, his expensive suit and calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. He caught John's eye and offered a slight smile, a message received. Webb had leaked the story himself. He'd realized that John and Doc were closing in on the truth, and he'd decided to control the narrative by going public on his own terms. Now, instead of a careful, methodical investigation, they had a media-feeding frenzy that could be shaped and spun by whoever told the most compelling story first. Webb approached the reporters, his politician's instincts taking over. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your interest in this matter. I've just learned about these allegations myself, and I want to assure everyone that my family and I welcome a full investigation. If remains have indeed been found on Mr. Slater's property, they deserve proper identification and respectful treatment. Mr. Mayor, are you aware of allegations connecting your great-grandfather to the disappearance of the Brennan family? Jennifer Martinez pressed. Webb's expression registered perfect surprise and concern. I am now, and I'm shocked by such claims. My great-grandfather was a respected member of this community. He worked as a guide and helped many families settle in this territory safely. The suggestion that he might have harmed anyone is both painful and, frankly, absurd, without solid evidence. We have evidence. Doc stepped forward, unable to contain himself. We have Thomas Brennan's journal, describing how your great-grandfather led them into a trap. The reporters turned their cameras toward Doc, sensing conflict. Webb's expression remained sorrowful, but firm. Dr. Brennan, I understand this is personal for you. I've recently learned that you're descended from the Brennan family, but a journal allegedly from 1884, found under circumstances we don't fully understand. That's not evidence. That's a story, and stories can be fabricated. Are you saying we fabricated this? John asked, anger rising. I'm saying we need proper forensic analysis, authentication from multiple sources, and a thorough investigation before we destroy reputations based on documents that conveniently appear after more than a century. Webb turned back to the cameras. I'm calling for a full, independent investigation. I'm recommending that the State Attorney General's office get involved to ensure impartiality. My family has nothing to hide. It was a masterful performance, John had to admit. Webb had positioned himself as the reasonable party, calling for truth and transparency, while casting doubt on the evidence without directly challenging it. He'd turned the situation from an accusation into a mystery that needed solving, with himself as an interested party seeking answers rather than a suspect avoiding them. Sheriff Morrison tried to restore order, eventually getting most of the media to leave with promises of an official statement later. But the damage was done. The story was out, incomplete and sensationalized, spreading through social media and news feeds. After the last reporter left, Webb approached John directly. Doc and Sheriff Morrison stood nearby, tense and watchful. You should have come to me first, Webb said quietly. We could have handled this with dignity, privately. Now you've turned a family tragedy into a public spectacle. Your great-grandfather murdered 5 people, John said flatly, including 2 children. That's not something you handle privately, allegedly. And even if it's true, even if my ancestor did something terrible 140 years ago, what does that have to do with me? I wasn't born. I didn't benefit from any crime. You're trying to punish me for something I had no part in. You knew, Doc said. You've known all along what your family's wealth was built on. Webb's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold beneath. Prove it. Prove I knew anything. You can't, because you have no evidence against me. You have a story about a man who's been dead for almost a century. That's all you have. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and John, those donkeys you're so fond of? I've contacted animal control about having them evaluated. Their behavior has been erratic, possibly dangerous. It would be a shame if they had to be put down for public safety reasons. The threat was clear and delivered with a smile. Webb walked to his car and drove away, leaving the 3 men standing in the fading light. He's going to try to destroy the evidence, Doc said, and eliminate the only witnesses who can't be discredited. John looked at the donkeys, who'd watched the entire confrontation with their characteristic intensity. Grace met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw understanding. They'd been fighting this battle for 140 years. They weren't about to lose now. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't get the chance, John said. It's time to stop playing defense and go on the attack. Webb made a mistake today. He showed us he's scared. Scared people make errors. We just need to be ready when he makes his. Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly. I'll assign a deputy to watch your property tonight. And tomorrow, we're getting a court order to protect those donkeys and the excavation site. Webb may have influence, but he doesn't control the entire legal system. As night fell and Morrison left, John stood with Doc looking at the 3 animals who'd started this whole chain of events. They'd survived more than a century and outlived everyone connected to their original tragedy. Now, in what might be their final battle, they'd found allies who wouldn't abandon them. The question was whether justice delayed for 140 years could still be justice at all. John was determined to find out. The media attention that followed transformed Bitter Springs from a quiet Montana town into a temporary circus of reporters, curiosity seekers, and armchair detectives. John's ranch became a destination for people wanting to see the Ayahot, 3 mysterious donkeys, and the burial site that had sparked such controversy. Sheriff Morrison stationed deputies at the property entrance, turning away unauthorized visitors. But the disruption to John's normal life was profound and unsettling. Dr. Chen's preliminary forensic report arrived 3 days after the media explosion. She'd worked around the clock, understanding that time was of the essence. The report confirmed that the remains were consistent with 5 individuals, 3 adults and 2 children, who had died in the mid to late 1800s. Trauma to several skulls suggested violent death. Carbon dating samples had been sent to 3 independent laboratories for verification. But the report's most significant finding came from an unexpected source. Among the remains, Dr. Chen had found fragments of a leather saddlebag that had been protected from decay by its position beneath one of the bodies. Inside that bag, still legible after more than a century, were promissory notes, a bill of sale for land in Missouri, and a letter of credit from a bank in St. Louis, all bearing the name Thomas Brennan and totaling exactly $10,000. This corroborates the journal, Dr. Chen explained during a meeting in Sheriff Morrison's office. We can trace these financial instruments, verify they were issued to Thomas Brennan, and establish that he was indeed carrying substantial assets when he disappeared. Morrison leaned forward. Can we connect any of this to Garrison Webb Sr.'s sudden acquisition of property in 1885? That's where it gets interesting. I did some digging into property records. Webb Sr. purchased his initial land parcel for $8,000 in gold. The transaction was recorded, but there's no documentation of where he obtained that gold. For a working guide, accumulating that much wealth would have taken years, possibly decades, yet he made the purchase less than a year after the Brennan family disappeared. Circumstantial, Morrison said, but compelling when combined with Thomas Brennan's journal. The investigation had attracted attention from beyond Bitter Springs. The state attorney general had indeed appointed a special investigator, a woman named Patricia Drummond, with a reputation for thoroughness and political independence. She'd arrived 2 days earlier and had been systematically reviewing every piece of evidence. Drummond sat across from Morrison's desk, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp with intelligence. What we have is a strong historical case for murder. What we don't have is a criminal case against anyone living. Garrison Webb Sr. is long dead. Even if we prove conclusively that he killed the Brennan family, we can't prosecute a dead man. What about his descendants? Doc asked. They've been living on stolen money for generations. Unless we can prove they knew the money was stolen and actively participated in concealing the crime, there's no legal basis for prosecution. And even if we could prove the current mayor knew about his great-grandfather's actions, knowledge of a historical crime isn't itself criminal, so he just gets away with it. John's frustration boiled over. 5 people were murdered, and there's no accountability? I didn't say that, Drummond replied. There are other forms of accountability beyond criminal prosecution: public disclosure, civil action by descendants of the victims, restitution, historical record. If we can prove the Webb family fortune was built on stolen assets, Dr. Brennan here might have grounds for a civil suit to recover those assets. Doc looked stunned. I don't want money. I want justice for my great-grand-uncle's family. Sometimes justice takes different forms than we expect, Drummond said gently. The question we need to answer is, what outcome would honor the memory of those who died? That evening, John sat on his porch with the 3 donkeys in the nearby corral. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He'd been thinking about Drummond's question. What would honor the Brennan family? Grace approached the fence, resting her head over the rail. John scratched behind her ears, marveling again at these animals who'd somehow carried a burden across impossible years. Whether through some mystery of nature he couldn't understand, or simply through the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, mother to foal, the memory had been preserved. What do you want? He asked them softly. You led me to the truth. But what happens now? What would finally let you rest? The donkeys couldn't answer, not in words. But Grace's gentle pressure against his hand, Hope's quiet presence, Steadfast's watchful stance, together they communicated something. They wanted the truth acknowledged. They wanted the dead remembered. They wanted justice, yes, but perhaps more than that. They wanted recognition that the Brennan family had mattered, that their deaths hadn't been meaningless, that someone cared enough to bring them home. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. A woman arrived at Morrison's office, elderly and using a cane, introducing herself as Margaret Halstead from Helena. She'd seen the news coverage and had information about the Webb family. I was Garrison Webb Jr.'s housekeeper for 30 years, she explained, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. I worked for him from 1960 until his death in 1990. There are things I know, things I saw, that I've kept quiet about because I was afraid. But I'm 83 years old now, and I can't take these secrets to my grave. Morrison recorded her statement carefully. Margaret described how Garrison Jr. had kept his father's confession journal in a locked cabinet in his study. She'd seen it once, when cleaning, and had been curious enough to read several pages. What she'd read had horrified her, but Junior had caught her and made her swear never to speak of it. He'd threatened to ruin her reputation, to ensure she never worked again. Given the Webb family's influence, she'd believed him. He used to take that journal out on the anniversary of his father's death, Margaret continued. He'd sit in his study drinking whiskey and reading it. Sometimes I'd hear him crying. I think it haunted him, knowing what his father had done, knowing his whole life was built on murder, but he didn't have the courage to tell the truth either. So he just kept the secret and passed it to his son. "Do you know if the current mayor has this journal?" Drummond asked. "I can't say for certain, but Junior told me once that he'd made his son read it when the boy turned 21. Said every Webb man needed to know the truth about where they came from. The mayor knows. He's always known. This testimony, combined with the physical evidence and historical records, painted a damning picture. But Drummond was right. Knowing about a crime committed by one's ancestor wasn't itself criminal. They needed something more. The answer came from an unexpected quarter. A forensic accountant named Robert Kim, working on behalf of Dr. Brennan's potential civil case, had been tracing the Webb family finances back through generations. What he found was a pattern of careful money laundering that extended into the present day. The original 8,000 in gold became property, Kim explained, spreading documents across the conference table. That property was sold in 1890 for a profit, which was reinvested. Over generations, the money was moved, invested, and transferred through various entities. But here's the interesting part. Starting in 1985, when the current Garrison Webb took control of the family holdings, there's evidence of deliberate concealment. He pointed to a series of transactions. Webb created a complex network of trusts and shell companies. On the surface, it looks like sophisticated estate planning. But look at the timing. These structures were created just before he ran for mayor. He was hiding the true extent and origin of his wealth. "Is that illegal?" Morrison asked. "Possibly. If he was concealing assets to avoid disclosure requirements for elected officials, that's a crime. If he was laundering money he knew came from criminal activity, even historical criminal activity, that could constitute a separate offense. And here's the key. Some of these trusts have been funded within the last 5 years. This isn't just inherited wealth he's passively enjoying. He's actively managing and concealing assets he knows have a criminal origin." Drummond leaned back, a slight smile crossing her face. "Now we have something. Mr. Kim, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report documenting every finding. Sheriff Morrison, I want subpoenas for all of Webb's financial records. We're going to tear apart every transaction, every trust, every shell company. If there's evidence of ongoing financial crimes, we can build a case." Over the next week, the investigation intensified. Webb, sensing the walls closing in, made his own moves. He held a press conference announcing his resignation as mayor, effective immediately, claiming health concerns and family obligations. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, a good man whose ancestor had done terrible things. "I cannot change the past," he said to the cameras, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. "If my great-grandfather committed the crimes alleged, I condemn his actions absolutely. But I cannot be held responsible for events that occurred before I was born. I'm stepping down to focus on my family and to remove any appearance of impropriety from the ongoing investigation." It was a strategic retreat, designed to generate sympathy and distance himself from the mounting evidence. But John, watching the broadcast with Doc and Morrison, saw through the performance. "He's not giving up," John said. "He's repositioning, making himself look cooperative while his lawyers work behind the scenes to protect his assets." "Probably," Morrison agreed. "But he's also making mistakes. His resignation is essentially an admission that there's something to hide. An innocent man would fight to clear his name, not run away from it." That night, John checked on the donkeys before bed, a ritual that had become essential to his peace of mind. They seemed calmer than they'd been in weeks, as if they could sense the approaching resolution. Grace nuzzled his shoulder, and John felt a wave of affection for these extraordinary animals. "We're almost there," he told them quietly. "Just a little while longer, and everyone will know the truth. The Brennan family will be remembered. Your vigil is almost over." But even as he spoke the words, John couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Webb had been backed into a corner, and cornered animals, human or otherwise, were at their most dangerous. The real confrontation was still coming, and when it did, John had a feeling it would test everything he believed about justice, truth, and the price of both. The call came at 2 a.m, jolting John from uneasy sleep. Sheriff Morrison's voice was tight with urgency. "John, we have a situation. Webb's house is on fire. The whole thing is going up." John was dressed and in his truck within minutes, driving the dark roads into town with his heart pounding. The glow was visible from miles away, orange flames licking at the night sky. By the time he arrived, the fire department had multiple trucks on scene, but the house was already a total loss. The blaze was too intense, too comprehensive to be accidental. Morrison met him at the police barricade. Accelerant was used. Multiple points of origin. Someone wanted to make sure nothing survived. Webb? He claims he was at his cabin up in the mountains. Got word from a neighbor and drove down. Says he has no idea who would do this. Morrison's tone made clear he didn't believe that story for a second. "The journal," John said. "The confession. It was in that house, along with any other family documents that might have supported our case. Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say? We were about to execute those financial subpoenas tomorrow morning." They watched the flames consume what was left of the structure. John felt a crushing sense of defeat. Without the confession journal, without the family records, their case became much harder to prove. Webb had destroyed the evidence, and unless they could prove he'd ordered the arson, he might actually get away with it. Doc arrived, his face grim in the firelight. "I heard on the scanner. He burned it all, didn't he?" "Looks that way," Morrison confirmed. "We still have the physical evidence from the burial site," Doc said. "The bones, the journal Thomas Brennan wrote, that doesn't go away." "No, but without the confession to tie it directly to Webb's ancestor, it becomes a historical mystery rather than a solved case. We can prove people were murdered. Proving who murdered them becomes much harder." John walked back to his truck, needing distance from the destruction. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. "Saw the news. This doesn't change the forensic evidence. We keep going." He was about to respond when he noticed movement near his truck. A figure stood in the shadows beyond the fire trucks. Garrison Webb himself, watching the blaze with an expression John couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more complex. Regret mixed with determination. Their eyes met across the distance. Webb walked over slowly, his expensive clothes rumpled, ash smudged on his face. "I didn't do this," Webb said without preamble. "I know you think I did, but I didn't. Your house burns down the night before we execute subpoenas for your financial records, and you expect me to believe that's coincidence? I expect you to believe I'm not stupid. Burning my own house, destroying my own property. That's an obvious move that points directly at me. If I wanted to destroy evidence, there are a dozen better ways that wouldn't involve arson investigation and insurance fraud." John studied the man's face, trying to read truth from deception. "Then who did?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. "My son, Marcus. He's been unstable for years. I've kept it quiet, gotten him treatment, tried to protect him. When all this started, when the news broke about the Brennan family, he became obsessed with the idea that I'd destroy our family's reputation. He must have broken into my house," and Webb's voice cracked. "I should have seen it coming. I should have known what he was capable of. Where is your son now?" "I don't know. He's not answering his phone. I'm worried he might." Webb couldn't finish the sentence Morrison had approached during the conversation. "Mr. Webb, if what you're saying is true, we need to find your son immediately. Not just for the arson investigation, but for his own safety." "I know," Webb said quietly. "I'll cooperate fully. But there's something else you should know. The confession journal wasn't in the house. I moved it to a safe deposit box at the bank 2 days ago, along with all the other family documents you were going to subpoena. They're safe." John felt the ground shift beneath him. "Why would you do that if you were trying to hide evidence?" "Because I'm tired," Webb said simply. "Tired of carrying my family's sins. tired of protecting a secret that's poisoned 3 generations. My great-grandfather was a murderer. My grandfather knew and did nothing. My father knew and did nothing. I knew, and I've spent my whole life pretending I didn't, but I'm done pretending. Those people deserve justice, even if it destroys everything my family built. Morrison pulled out his radio. I'm calling for units to search for Marcus Webb. John, I need you to... The explosion cut him off mid-sentence. A massive blast from the direction of John's ranch, visible as a bright flash, followed by a rolling boom that echoed off the mountains. John's blood ran cold. The barn, he said. Someone just blew up my barn, where the 3 donkeys were stabled for the night. He was running for his truck before anyone could stop him, Morrison and Webb shouting behind him. The drive back to the ranch took 8 minutes that felt like hours. As he crested the final hill, he could see flames consuming his barn, the structure already collapsed into burning rubble. John slammed the truck into park and ran toward the fire, screaming for the donkeys. The heat drove him back, intense and overwhelming. Deputies who'd been stationed at the property were already there with fire extinguishers. But it was hopeless. Nothing could survive that inferno. Morrison arrived moments later, restraining John physically as he tried to charge into the flames. You can't help them. John, you can't. But John had already seen what he needed to see. Through the flames and smoke, 3 dark shapes moving away from the barn into the pasture. The donkeys had gotten out. Somehow, impossibly, they'd escaped before the explosion. He broke free from Morrison and ran towards them. Grace, Hope, and Steadfast stood together in the far corner of the pasture, shaken but alive. Their coats were singed, and they trembled with fear, but they were intact. Thank God, John breathed, running his hands over each animal, checking for injuries. Thank God you're all right. A deputy approached, phone in hand. Sheriff, we found Marcus Webb. He's barricaded himself in the old processing plant on the edge of town. Says he won't come out until he finishes what his family started. The old processing plant sat on the eastern edge of Bitter Springs, a relic from the town's brief mining boom in the 1920s. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. Now it was surrounded by police vehicles, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Sheriff Morrison had established a perimeter and called for state police backup. Inside the building, Marcus Webb had made his position clear through increasingly erratic phone calls. He blamed his father for bringing shame on the family, blamed John for digging up the past, blamed the donkeys for being demonic witnesses that wouldn't let the dead rest. He's not stable, Morrison told the assembled officers. Potentially armed, definitely dangerous to himself and others. We need a negotiator, not a tactical response. But John, standing at the edge of the perimeter with Doc, knew this wasn't really about Marcus Webb's mental state. This was about a family curse playing out across generations, each Webb man inheriting not just wealth, but the moral weight of how that wealth was obtained. Marcus had apparently broken under the pressure his father and grandfather had managed to contain. Garrison Webb arrived, haggard and desperate. Morrison initially refused to let him near the scene, but Webb pleaded, "He's my son. Let me talk to him. Let me try to end this without anyone else getting hurt." After consultation with the state police commander, Morrison agreed to let Webb try. They set up a phone connection, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. "Marcus, it's Dad. Please, son, come out. We can get you help." Marcus's voice came through, high-pitched and trembling. "Help? You want to help me? You've been lying my whole life. You told me we were good people, that our family built this town through honest work. But I found the journals, Dad. I read what great-great-grandfather did. We're murderers. Our whole life is built on blood money." "You're right," Webb said, his voice breaking. "You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth sooner. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself. I was a coward, son, just like my father was, and his father before him, but you don't have to be." You can be the one who breaks the cycle. You can come out and face this with dignity. It's too late, don't you see? They'll never let us forget. That Slater and his demon donkeys, they won't rest until we're destroyed. John stepped forward. Marcus, this is John Slater. Those donkeys aren't demons. They're just animals who remembered something terrible and needed someone to listen. This isn't about destroying your family. It's about acknowledging what happened to the Brennan family. They deserve that much. The Brennans are dead. They've been dead for 140 years. Why can't everyone just leave them dead? Because truth matters. Doc's voice joined the conversation. I'm Dr. Edmund Brennan. Thomas and Sarah Brennan were my great-grand-uncle and his wife. Their children, Emma and James, were my cousins, several generations removed. They matter to me. They deserve to be remembered as people, not just forgotten victims. There was silence on the line, then sobbing. I'm so sorry. Marcus whispered. I'm so sorry for what my family did to yours. I wanted to make it stop. I wanted to erase it all. The house, the barn, the donkeys, everything that reminded us. But I can't erase the past. Can I? No, Doc said gently. None of us can, but we can acknowledge it. We can try to make it right, even now. Marcus, your father has agreed to turn over your family's documents. The confession journal, all of it. The truth is coming out whether you surrender or not, but you can choose how you face it. You can choose to do the right thing now. Another long silence, then the sound of a door opening. Marcus Webb emerged from the building, hands raised, tears streaming down his face. Officers moved in carefully, securing him without incident. As they led him to a patrol car, his father embraced him briefly, both men weeping. John watched the scene with mixed emotions. Justice was being served, but at what cost? A young man's mental breakdown, a family's public destruction, a community's faith in its leaders shattered. Was this what the Brennan family would have wanted? He looked back toward his ranch, where the 3 donkeys waited in the temporary shelter he'd arranged. Despite everything, the fire, the explosion, the chaos, they'd survived. They'd outlasted everyone who'd tried to silence them, outlived everyone connected to the original crime. Their persistence across impossible years had finally brought truth to light. Morrison approached, looking exhausted. We'll need your statement about the explosion, and we'll need to process the barn as a crime scene once it's safe. I know. For what it's worth, John, you did the right thing, following those donkeys, digging up that wagon, pushing for truth. It wasn't easy, and it's caused a lot of pain, but it was right. John nodded slowly. The hard part now is figuring out what comes next. We've exposed the crime, we've got confessions, we've got the remains properly identified, but do we have justice? Can there even be justice for something that happened so long ago? I think we're about to find out, Morrison replied. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, dawn approaching after the longest night John could remember. In a few hours, the whole town would wake to news of the overnight events. The story would spread beyond Bitter Springs, perhaps even nationally. The tale of 3 donkeys who'd waited more than a century to reveal a murder would capture imaginations everywhere. But for John, standing in the pre-dawn light, watching emergency vehicles slowly depart, the story felt deeply personal. He'd been chosen, somehow, by 3 remarkable animals to be the one who listened. They'd trusted him with their terrible secret, and he'd honored that trust by seeing it through to the end. Now came the harder work, helping a community heal from revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their history, and finding a way to properly honor the memory of 5 people who died far from home, their dreams of a new life extinguished by greed and violence. The sun broke over the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. A new day was beginning, one where truth, however painful, had finally displaced comfortable lies. John took a deep breath and headed back to his ranch, to the 3 donkeys who'd made all of this possible, to begin the work of rebuilding what fire had destroyed and preserving what time had revealed. 6 months had passed since the night of fire and revelation. Spring had returned to Montana, painting the valley in shades of green that seemed almost too vibrant after the gray winter. John stood beside a newly erected monument in the Bitter Springs Cemetery, the morning sun warming his shoulders as he read the inscription one more time, in memory of the Brennan family. Thomas Brennan, Sarah Brennan, Robert Brennan, Emma Brennan, and James Brennan, travelers who journeyed west seeking a better life in 1884, murdered in these mountains and buried in silence for 141 years. May they finally rest in peace, remembered and honored. The remains had been properly interred after extensive forensic analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. These were indeed the Brennan family members whose disappearance had been a mystery for over a century. DNA testing had confirmed Doc Brennan's familial connection through Robert Brennan's line, who it turned out had not died with his sister, but had survived to establish himself in Bitter Springs, carrying the grief of not knowing what happened to his family. The monument stood in a prominent location, impossible to miss for anyone visiting the cemetery. Below the names, a smaller plaque read, "Discovered through the persistent remembrance of 3 faithful companions who never forgot." Even in death, the donkey's role was acknowledged. Those 3 companions now stood in a newly rebuilt barn on John's property, watching him through the open door as he worked on his morning chores. Grace's coat gleamed in the sunlight, properly groomed and healthy. Hope had put on weight and moved with new confidence. Steadfast, still watchful, but noticeably more relaxed, had finally allowed John to trim his hooves without resistance. The barn itself was better than what had burned, a community effort that had surprised John with its generosity. Once the full story became public, once people understood what the donkeys represented and what they'd endured, donations had poured in. Ranchers contributed materials, contractors volunteered labor, and within 2 months, John had a barn that would have cost him $50,000 to build on his own. "Bitter Springs takes care of its own," Clem had said, while helping install the new stall doors. "Even when its own are stubborn old donkeys who know too much." The legal aftermath had been complex, but ultimately satisfying in ways John hadn't anticipated. Garrison Webb had kept his word, turning over the confession journal and all family documents. The journal was now housed in the Montana Historical Society, available for researchers studying the darker aspects of westward expansion. Webb himself had faced multiple charges: financial fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to conceal criminal proceeds. The trial had been brief, with Webb pleading guilty to all charges. He'd been sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay substantial restitution to Dr. Brennan as the heir of the murdered family. Marcus Webb had been placed in a mental health facility rather than prison, deemed not competent to stand trial for the arson and attempted murder charges. His father had ensured he received the best care available, one final act of paternal responsibility before beginning his own incarceration. The Webb family fortune, built on stolen gold and blood money, had been largely dismantled. Properties were sold, trusts dissolved, and the proceeds divided between restitution payments and a charitable foundation established in the Brennan family's name. The foundation would provide scholarships for descendants of families who'd suffered historical injustices, a small attempt to transform evil into good. Doc Brennan had used his portion of the restitution to create a research center dedicated to studying historical crimes and cold cases in the American West. "There are probably dozens of stories like the Brennans," he'd told John. "Families who disappeared, murders that were never solved, injustices that were buried and forgotten. If we could solve even a few of them, give some other families closure, wouldn't that honor what those donkeys accomplished?" The story had indeed captured national attention, as Morrison had predicted. Documentary filmmakers had approached John about telling the story. A best-selling author wanted to write a book. Scientists had requested permission to study the donkey, trying to understand their impossible longevity and apparent memory preservation. John had turned down most of these requests, uncomfortable, protective of the animals who'd already given so much. But he'd agreed to one project, a children's book about loyalty, persistent, the important forgotten. The proceeds would go to the Brennan. As spring deeply summed life, John still trained horses, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged of the previous year. But now he also served as unofficial guard who'd become some. Schools brought children a story. Just on warm evenings, John would sit on his porch with the 3 donkeys grazing nearby, and he'd think about Margaret. She would have loved this strange turn his life had taken, would have appreciated the symmetry of broken things finding purpose together. The loneliness hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something less painful, a peaceful solitude rather than an aching emptiness. Doc stopped by regularly, and they'd become true friends rather than just acquaintances. They'd talk about the case, about family history, about the strange ways justice could manifest across generations. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, watching the mountains change colors as the sun set. "Do you ever wonder how they knew?" Doc asked one evening, gesturing to the donkeys. "How they remembered for so long, how they knew to lead you to that exact spot." John had thought about this question countless times. "I've stopped trying to explain it. Some things don't need rational explanations. Maybe they're just very old and very stubborn donkeys who happened to wander near that wagon enough times to notice something wrong. Maybe there's something we don't understand about animal memory and instinct. Or maybe," he paused, watching Grace nuzzle Hope affectionately, "maybe sometimes the universe makes sure important stories don't stay buried forever." "I like that explanation best," Doc said. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, John walked out to the corral for his nightly check on the animals. Grace came to him immediately, pressing her soft muzzle against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck, feeling the warmth of her living presence, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "You did it," he whispered. "You waited all those years, and you finally got someone to listen. The Brennans are remembered now. They're at peace, and you 3 extraordinary creatures, you can rest too." Grace pulled back to look at him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. In their depths, John saw something that looked like contentment. The burden had been lifted. The vigil was over. The long wait for justice had ended. The 3 donkeys of Bitter Springs had completed their mission, bringing truth from darkness and ensuring that 5 forgotten souls would be forgotten no more. Now, in the twilight of their impossible lives, they could finally know peace. John stood with them under the stars, grateful beyond words for the privilege of being chosen to help them complete their journey. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important work we do comes from simply being willing to listen, to really listen, when others have given up trying to speak. The mountains stood eternal and silent, holding their countless stories. But tonight, at least, one of those stories had been told, remembered, and honored, and 3 faithful witnesses could rest at last.